Hello, everyone. This is David again. As with last time, I thought I'd give a short lecture, and emphasis on short, on some of the overarching concepts that we deal with in this unit. I'm really going to focus on air power. We'll pick up on deterrence later. The object of this is not to dwell on a bunch of details that you should already be familiar with, because I assume that you're going through the course content at the moment and doing the readings and so on. So I'm not going to get into a great amount of detail. Rather, what I wanted to do was just cover a few overarching ideas and explain, for what it's worth, the way that I look at the subject of this unit's discussion. I've started off here with a quote. This is from Winston Churchill, stating the obvious, or maybe not so obvious, that air power is the most difficult of military force to measure or even to express in precise terms. I think this is like a lot of things, right? That actually definitions are always difficult. But air power is difficult to define because it has a lot of so many aspects to it. In the popular imagination, of course, when we think about air power, most people would, the first image to leap to mind is, aircraft dropping bombs or strafing the ground or whatever. We think of combat, and certainly air attack and air defense are a primary aspect of air power. But it has many other functions, of course. Air transport, the logistical and transport function of air power is enormously important in contemporary warfare. It's hard to think of how we would conduct expeditionary campaigning these days without air transport. So of course that's an enormous part of air power. But the original function of air power, long-lasting and probably, well, I don't know, the most significant, but certainly a really extremely important role of air power is reconnaissance, surveillance, and intelligence gathering in general. So it's a bit hard to pin down these things, but we need basically to understand that when we talk about air power, that we need to understand it in the round, and not simply as another means of delivering combat power, of delivering ordnance, but as a ingredient of contemporary warfare that has broad application across a range of categories. Okay, let's move to the next slide here. Right, here we have an extract from a book I quite like. It's by a fellow named John Gooch, Professor John Gooch. He's the editor of this book. It's a bit old now. Came out 20 years ago in 1995. It's called Air Power: Theory and Practice. This extract is from page 1 of that book. John Gooch is a well-known military historian. He's professor of international history at the University of Leeds, where he's been for well over 20 years. He's the author of over a dozen books on British and European military history, strategic studies more generally. He's a co-founding editor of the Journal of Strategic Studies, and so on. So a very important figure in the field. And I've taken this extract because I think from the beginning of that book, because I think he captures in it a lot of the really important themes in the discussion of air power. I'll read it out to you because my handwriting's rubbish. First used in action by Italy during the Libyan War of 1911-1912, aeroplanes played an important part in the First World War and a major and still controversial role in the Second World War. The manned bomber, central to all theories of strategic air power, remained unchallenged as the most powerful means of delivering ordnance from the air until the advent of the ICBM in 1957. Thereafter, air power has had to strenuously justify its place as a co-equal in the defense triad, both in budgetary and in operational terms. To do this, airmen have deployed history to justify their claim to parity with, or even preeminence over, the other services. They have also sought to demonstrate that late 20th century wars have been won by strategic air power, or could have been so had the air arm been properly and freely used. It's an interesting quote, I think. It covers a lot of ground in this and picks up I pulled out here some points which I think are important. First is, it's a controversial subject. We, as one of the articles that you've been assigned for this unit, is the Great Air Power Debate. And it's important to realize that we have been having an air power debate for 100 years, or near on 100 years. And in this debate, air power has had at times needed to justify its place relative to other services, both in, as he says, in operational terms, but sometimes even more importantly in budgetary terms. And in order to do this, air forces have sometimes air power has even claimed preeminence over the other services. In particular, this was the case in the early days of air power, as I'll demonstrate in the following slides, when there were very grand claims made for its independent war-winning ability. And this is an idea which has persisted throughout the history of armed conflict, from the invention of aircraft to this day. There has been this long-running controversy and debate over the place of air power and its potential independent war-winning ability. Let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned that air power is a bit difficult to define, but I think, if we take a step back and look at it objectively or more generally, then we can say, look, basically, for me at any rate, we can say air power is the exploitation of the vertical dimension for the purposes of the war. Right? So echoing that line from Clausewitz that we discussed in Unit 1 in his definition of strategy. And I like this because I think, in basic terms, that's all it is. Right? It is the use of that vertical dimension in warfare. We, of course, associate this now with manned aircraft, with powered aircraft, but the post-Wright brothers form of aircraft. But it is interesting to consider that actually this idea of the exploitation of the vertical, this very general definition of air power, is one that precedes the Wright brothers. It precedes the powered, heavier-than-air flight. It actually goes back, it actually goes back at least a century before that, when various European powers began to experiment with the use of tethered hot air balloons for the purposes of aerial reconnaissance, essentially, using hot air balloons tethered over one's forces to get an elevated position of observation, which of course would deliver considerable informational advantage. And this actually is a use of air power that started, as I said, not 100 years ago, but 200 years ago, over 200 years ago. The first recorded instance of this the first recorded instance of the use of tethered hot air balloons for the purpose of aerial observation actually occurred in the Battle of Flers in 1794, which was a battle between French forces and Dutch-Belgian force, in which the French commander used a tethered hot air balloon, which was sent up to a height of a couple of 100 feet, I believe it was, with two observers effectively in a basket suspended below, who were able to observe the movements of the Dutch, of the respective forces on the battlefield, and communicate what was happening to the French commander on the ground. Effectively, they were sending handwritten notes down to the ground, basically on a string, almost like an old-fashioned clothesline. So, and this use of air balloons for observation continued to develop throughout the 19th century. So it featured largely in the American Civil War, for instance, where balloons were used by both sides. And by the middle of the 19th century, all the major powers were able to were using balloons of various types for observation purposes, both on land and at sea. But I think a very interesting example of the use of air power before the invention of the aircraft is actually from the 1870-1871 Franco-Prussian War. In that instance, the Prussian army had invaded France and was laying siege to the French capital of Paris. The French government in Paris had not yet surrendered and had active armies in the provinces with which it was attempting to communicate. The mode of communication initially was through telegraph, but once those lines had been severed, they were trying to communicate with their still active armies through carrier pigeons, which had been exchanged with provincial headquarters prior to the hostilities. Now, the Prussians, of course, Prussian military intelligence, knowing full well about sort of communications capabilities of the French, and obviously wanting to prevent the communication of the French authorities with their active armies, deployed around the city of Paris several squadrons of Falcon interceptors. These are basically trained hunting birds, which were set up in a ring around the city to intercept French carrier pigeons. So I think this is kind of interesting to think that 40 years before the invention of the first manned heavier than air fighter aircraft, we already had an instance of the use of the vertical dimension for the interception of communications. Right. So, not to belabor the point, air power, the use in that sense of just the use of the vertical dimension for the purposes of the war, is something which precedes the aircraft. That being said, of course, this is a story that really gets going in earnest in the context of the First World War. In that, from 1914 through 1918, a gigantic and gigantic conflagration, a total war between the major powers of the day, who were deploying all of their resources against each other and all of their ingenuity against each other. And of course, very rapidly in those 4 short years of the war, there was enormous development in the use of the vertical dimension in aircraft design of all types, of technique, of employment, and so on. There are 2 major ideas with respect to air power that come out of the First World War. I'm going to talk mainly about the first one here, strategic bombing, which I've got in inverted commas. But alongside what also happens, alongside this story, and I think it's the story that our 2 presenters in this unit are going to focus on, is the idea of air-ground coordination, about the integration of air-delivered ordnance into the broader combined arms package, or the development of what the American military analyst, operational analyst and military historian Stephen Biddle has described as the modern system, which basically the modern system is what we would now recognize as the Western way of warfare, the combined arms system of arms and techniques which allow military operations, to take place under the conditions of very highly lethal weapon systems. Of course, and this. So Biddle's point, and I think it's a good one, is that the modern system is really born in the cauldron of World War I, where as a result of the efforts of all the belligerent powers to find an answer, to find a way to unlock the stalemate of trench warfare, and they come up with the modern system, which most of the major powers would have mastered to a greater or lesser degree by 1918, and then continued to develop and perfect and to practice through the 20th century, and indeed into today. Okay, so not to belabor the point, World War I is really chapter 1 in this story, the obvious starting point for our considerations of the role of air power in modern war. Let's go to the next slide. So, having said that about the modern system, let's go back to this idea of strategic bombing, and this what you've got here on this slide. I won't try to read it because it's in German and I don't speak German, but it's what this is it's the lines from a German children's song of 1914. So already, really, just at the very beginning of the war, and I'll read it in English. All right, here's what it says. It says, "Zeppelin fly, help us in the war. Fly to England. England will be burnt. Zeppelin fly." Roughly speaking, I guess. And I've got this quote which I found it's at the beginning of a book I picked up on the Hindenburg, actually, sort of book looking at Zeppelins. And I think this is interesting because you can see even right at the very beginning of the war, where we're not even talking about, at this point, the trench stalemate is just months old, is just beginning to settle in, and we're not even yet talking about heavier than air aircraft, right? Bomber aircraft. We're talking about talking about zeppelins. We're talking about hot air balloons full of hydrogen, right? So we're talking about very, very early days of what we probably would now call strategic bombing or aerial mass bombardment. And already in the popular consciousness, people are beginning. You see that this idea of the electrifying potential of this mode of attack is being impressed on public consciousness, so that people are investing in this weapon system, ideas about big ideas about the degree to which it could win the war. And these ideas persist throughout the First World War and intensify through the interwar period, and of course are reinforced in the Second World War. Right? So this idea of the enormous power, war-winning quality of aerial bombardment comes really early in the days of air power. Let's move on to the next slide. So here I've got another extract from a noteworthy interwar military theorist whom you may recognize the name Basil Littlehart. He was actually was at King's College London even before war studies. His papers are held in the King's College Center for Military History archives. And so Littlehart, this extract is from a book he wrote on the future of war shortly after the First World War. It comes out in 1925. And I could have picked any number of interwar, air power, future of war thinkers. Several of them are mentioned in the unit content already, so you'll be familiar with the names of the Italian interwar air power theorist Giulio Douhet, Littlehart's British contemporary J.F.C. Fuller also speculated quite on the role of air power in the United States. The U.S. Air Force, sort of father of the U.S. Air Force, Billy Mitchell, was writing similar sorts of things in Britain. Hugh Trenchard, kind of, I suppose, intellectual godfather of the RAF, also writing things along similar lines to Littlehart. But I like this quote from Littlehart because I think it evokes the same sort of imagery as one sees being invoked in that children's song. Hang on, I'm going to pause here while I close the door. I've got an engine behind me. Okay, it's a little bit quieter. So I'm going to read this this quote. And it basically reflects how the early air power theorists imagined that air power was going to have a strategic effect. He says, "Imagine for a moment London, Birmingham, Manchester, and half a dozen other great centres simultaneously attacked, the business localities and Fleet Street wrecked, Whitehall a heap of rubble, the slum districts maddened into the impulse to break loose and maraud, the railways cut, factories destroyed. Would not the general will to resist vanish? And what use would be the still determined fractions of the nation without organization and central direction?" So we've got I think some interesting ideas here, some important ideas. And I'll pull out. So first is this idea of the maddened rabble, right? The maddened population. amidst the rubble of their cities, breaking loose and marauding. And this, in turn, would cause the vanishing or the destruction of the will to resist, okay, right? Going back to what we discussed about Clausewitz and the conception of war as an active force to compel one's enemy to do one's will, right? So the destruction of the will to resist by the causing of pain and destruction, of the destruction of wealth, the hammering of these cities. And then the idea that through air power you could paralyze or destroy the ability of a nation to conduct its defense, to conduct operations by destroying or significantly materially impacting its ability to organize itself and issue central direction, right? Basically, to attack its command and control systems and thereby impede its ability to resist and destroy and cause the destruction of wealth and inflict pain, which diminish its will to resist. So this is in a nutshell, this is the theory of the way the interwar air power theorists thought that air power was going to work in modern warfare. As it happens, as you've seen in the unit, in fact, these are this is actually there's a gap between. But this actually doesn't come to pass. The evidence is that the will to resist doesn't simply vanish when you bomb a city. In fact, if World War II experience is valid, then actually it can increase the will to resist, and actually also under the conditions of under the technological conditions in World War II, in fact, ruining the organization and ability to centrally direct systems, a nation's defense systems, industrial systems, and so on, is actually very hard to accomplish with the technology available of the day at the time. Nonetheless, in the 1920s, 1930s, there was considerable apprehension that the scenario which Little Hart describes here was entirely plausible. And I've got a quote here, a famous quote here from the British politician, 3 times Prime Minister, William Baldwin, from a famous speech he gave in the I forget the date. I think I'm pretty sure the year was it was early 1930s, 34, I think, when he warned that the bomber will always get through. And this was very much the climate of the time in that interwar period. This expectation that air power would be this uniquely effective instrument of coercion, and that there wasn't an effective defense against it. These ideas were pretty widely held at the time. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, before I get into World War II, I just wanted to say a few words about the actual practice in the interwar period. So, although in the interwar period you have guys like Douay and Fuller, Mitchell, Trenchard, Little Hart, who are talking about, they're imagining the use of air power in the context of another war like they'd just gone through with the First World War. So a grand conflict, a total war of the major industrial powers against each other, or to use the contemporary jargon, symmetric war or peer-to-peer form of war. So they were thinking of air power in those terms, but actually, as it was practiced in the interwar period, what you saw air power being used for primarily was in the context of small wars, of which there were quite a few in the interwar period. And so all of the European imperial powers, for instance, in this period, were kind of all simultaneously attracted to the idea of air power being a way for them of achieving relatively low cost and light footprint method of policing or maintaining their imperial enterprise. So Churchill, for example, was very impressed with the potential of air power to contribute to the pacification of recalcitrant tribesmen in the myriad brushfire wars of the British Empire, which of course was flung all over the globe. So we see the extensive use in the interwar period of air power in support of operations in the Northwest Frontier Province of the Raj. And also in the 1920s, in the British early 1920s, in the British campaign there, air power is used against the Iraqi forces to reasonable effect. There's a discussion at the time as well that particularly useful, for instance, would be not just the use of air power as a vehicle for delivering explosive and strafing and whatever and that sort of thing, but actually the possibility of using air power aircraft as a means of delivering gas attack. As I said, it's not just Britain; it's all of the imperial powers are attempting to use air power in this period in this way. So we've got Italy, for example, who's already been mentioned, doing this in Ethiopia. Right, so it's a fairly widespread idea. So the expectation, so basically, what I'm saying is, the theorists are talking about symmetric form of war. Naturally enough, they are anticipating the reoccurrence or the occurrence of a successor to the Great War. But actually, during this period, what the air power is being used for is in asymmetric war. Oops, don't need a double S there. Okay. Anyway, let's now move to the Second World War. Go to the next slide. All right, I just want to say a few words about World War II. There's a lot of material on this in the unit content and in the reading, but I just wanted to make a fairly basic observation here, and that is, right. So clearly, during World War II, there is enormous use of mass aerial bombardment. Indeed, if taken, I think, if you look at the war as a whole, the major contribution of the Western Allies to the campaign against Germany for most of the war, right, until the D-Day landings in 1944, is through the efforts of the RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. Air Force to to destroy German industry, to attack German cities, to undermine German morale, and so on. So most of the Western effort for many years of the war, in fact, is focused on the air effort. Indeed, in fact, I think I'm correct in saying that the units with the highest statistical casualty rate during the war were the bomber crews. So an enormous investment in the idea of air power and of its ability to bring Germany to its knees and compel it to surrender. So we can see the influence of that interwar thinking on the wartime air commanders and the way in which the strategy of the war developed. So we have this mass aerial bombardment. The big tension, though, in this period is between the idea of area bombing, which here we've got, which broadly speaking is the tactic followed by the RAF in Europe, right? Which is the target. If you go back to what Little Heart's point was, is the targeting of German cities with the intent of causing terror, demoralization of the civil populace, in the hope that this would translate into pressure on the political echelon. And so we get I've just mentioned a couple of cities here. Of course, the Dresden bombings, but Cologne is devastated. Berlin is devastated. Right? There are massive attacks on German cities, which are night bombings conducted at night. Huge raids. Of course, all right. So you'll be familiar with the basic outlines of this history. But the important point here is that this is not terribly accurate bombing. It is a form of bombing which achieves its effect through mass, right? Through covering a wide area with a large number of aircraft, delivering a large quantity of high explosive and incendiary, with on the logic that while the explosive would not be delivered accurately, that the major target was morale of the population. Now, I've identified this with the RAF, but of course it's important to note that with Japan, this was also essentially the approach of the American Air Force in its bombing campaign against Japan. So we see this with the firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities, and of course ultimately with the nuclear bombing of atomic bombing, of Hiroshima at the end, bringing about the end of the war. But anyway, so there's that idea of area bombing, which is very much, I think, actually a realistic appraisal of what could be achieved technologically in terms of accuracy. But there was still at the time this interest in precision bombing, and at least in the European theater, the U.S. Air Force was more interested was more determined in pursuing this idea of precision bombing. And the precision bombing, I don't want to dwell too long on it, because but the basic idea was that one would attempt to identify critical nodes or crucial, to imagine to see the enemy as a system, and to destroy certain parts of that system with a view to creating cascading effects. And the most well-known example of this is the targeting of German ball bearing factories. Right, if you think of ball bearings, ball bearings are integral, to the operation of any kind of mechanical engine and of motor vehicles of all types. And if you can destroy the country's ability to create ball bearings, then you can. And so you can think logically, then you can drastically affect its ability to produce the machinery of modern warfare. Similarly, attacking power generation facilities or critical transport nodes or oil refineries, things like that, is this idea of trying to apply air delivered ordnance in this precise, in a fairly precise, in inverted commas, right? There's a lot of precision. To apply force in this precise way with the hope of achieving this follow-on or this cascading effect. Right? So a slightly more sophisticated version of things than initially imagined by the likes of Little Hart. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So after the Second World War, we see the continuation of these ideas. Right, the idea of area bombing doesn't go away, obviously. In fact, that becomes the leitmotif of the Cold War, particularly after both superpowers develop the nuclear weapons. The leitmotif of the Cold War is the concept of mutual assured destruction, the targeting of cities, in fact, basically the destruction of entire nations. I don't have a lot to say about that at the moment. I think probably well understood, but certainly, like, the general point being that area bombing continues on as an aspect of military thought, but that nuclear weapons make the power of area bombing so great that effectively it becomes an unusable instrument, and it brings us to and so effectively the point of having an area bombing, city destroying capability becomes essentially to deter others who also have this ability from using that capability. Anyway, I don't want to talk about deterrence, at least on this slide. I mean, you can read about it in the unit content material, or we can continue the discussion on the thread if you wish. But I want to pick up with the idea of precision, which is kind of, as I said, had its beginnings in World War II, but is a thing which develops in the decades following, and where still very much dominates thinking on the use of air power today. So I want to kind of give my take on what are the main themes in this, and where is it driving us. And the first is, right, so obviously in the decades which follow the Second World War, there are, in my view, there are three trends. One, two, three. Three big trends. The first is the trend to more precision, right? And so that the idea, which is born in the First World War, of understanding the enemy's system, finding the critical nodes, attacking those critical nodes with the hope of achieving larger effects, but causing less destruction, requiring less, using less firepower to achieve, is consistently developed through this period. And so, better bomb sites are created, and then better bombs, right? Bombs which can be guided or can guide themselves in various ways. I don't want to dwell a whole bunch on the technology. The point is fairly straightforward. We become much better at applying force precisely, and this is largely a story of technology, and specifically of information technology, or information and communications technology. So basically, these weapons become more precise because of the development of microelectronics and microprocessors, of sophisticated communications equipment, of increasing power and sensitivity of sensors, and of the ability to move information around in a force, and so on and so on and so forth. So there is a technological driver there is a technological enablement of the drive to increasing precision, which basically kicks off from the end of the Second World War and continues on to our day. And so, today, even today, this is kind of continuous process of trying to get more accurate with smaller and smaller bombs. The second major development, or line of development, or trend in this respect, is somewhat more abstract, but it is what I've labeled here, this greater perception of ethical and legal restraint on the application of air power. So basically, to make a long story short, over the decades since the Second World War, the idea of actively targeting civil populations, or the homes of civil, or their homes and urban supporting infrastructure, becomes less and less credible, acceptable over time, and this is basically reflected in changing international norms, and changing not necessarily changes in the legal regime itself, though there are changes in the law, but changes in the way in which the legal regime is interpreted and articulated within defense circles and applied in practice. At any rate, the basic point being that there is an increasing perception through this period that force needs to be applied more precisely, because it is unacceptable to cause harm to civilians or to non-combatants, to cause more harm than is unnecessary. Now, we no doubt we'll get into a discussion of proportionality legitimate and illegitimate targets and so on. But which could be a very lengthy discussion. I'll just generalize in saying that this perception does sort of increase throughout the ensuing decades after the Second World War, from a norm where it was okay or considered, if not okay, then necessary to basically to blow away entire German cities, to one in which the idea of obliterating cities is considered anathematic or unacceptable. And then this, I've mentioned international law and the United Nations and so on, the legal regime as contributing to this development. But another aspect of this this development, I think we can probably agree, is the increasing mediatization of conflict after the Second World War, right? So that basically the images of the consequences of mass aerial bombing come out a lot more rapidly, or can have a greater effect, feedback effect on public will. The greater the level of mediatization of the conflict, the more aware, I suppose you could say, the public is about the cause, the consequences of this, the tragic consequences of this on other civilians, and this can contribute to, or many will argue that this contributes also to this increasing perception of the need of ethical restraint in the use of force. And of course, the developments, the mediatization of conflict is not unconnected with the development of information and communications technology. Right. Then finally, we have this third driver, which is related to the ones I've just mentioned, which is the idea of casualty sensitivity. Firstly, sensitivity about one's own casualties, but also to some extent also sensitivity about the causing of casualties in one's opponent, particularly in one's opponent's civil population. And so a bit like, where does this this drive us? Oh, I should mention, of course, right, casualty sensitivity too has a relationship with the mediatization of conflict, right? Which is why we sometimes hear about the vaunted CNN effect, right? CNN effect on warfare. So where does this lead us? Well, there's a lot of room to discuss where this leads us. But since we've been reading so much Luttwak, I thought I'd introduce this idea, which is one of his rather famous ones. It comes out in the mid-1990s, and it is this idea that what we've arrived at because of these ideas is something he calls post-heroic war, which is, to put it plainly, is a form of warfare which is interventionary, so it's fought, he's talking about the West, where the West intervenes in conflicts in which it has limited stakes, right? So it basically has a limited goals in the conflicts it's intervening in. Often there's not a great amount of will in the intervention. So politicians, naturally enough, want to have these interventions occur at a low cost, and with a low footprint or a light footprint, which is of course related to the idea of low cost. You want to keep low costs down. If you want to keep your costs of combat down, then having a light footprint on the ground is a good idea. If nothing else, because of the enormous long-term medical costs of which increasingly are source of apprehension, anxiety to budgeters now. So in the mid-90s, Luttwak says, look, this is driving us to this era of post-heroic warfare. And a number of other scholars kind of developed variants of this, or sort of similar ideas. So Colin McInnes says that we're in the era of spectator sport war. Martin Shaw talks about risk transfer war, and so on and so forth. And I think these ideas we continue, and air power clearly is integral to this ideal of low cost, low footprint, limited goals form of warfare, post heroic warfare, because right, air power is the enabler, is in theory or in hope the thing which enables you to continue to exert force, but to do so from a distance beyond the possibility of return, right, at a low cost. Now, clearly, this is all contentious, and I think we can discuss whether this is actually any of this actually makes sense. Right? Is it really true that that you can fight these low cost, low footprint, limited goals wars without boots on the ground or with low numbers? How can you get that? Is that actually a way to generate lasting and useful strategic effect? Personally, I'm skeptical, extremely skeptical of this, but nonetheless, that is the thinking, right? These are the drivers of it. We can clearly observe that these are big ideas that have had a big impact on the way in which armies have organized themselves and in the way in which we've conducted our war. So while I may not agree with it or think it is particularly strategically wise, it seems to me that it is happening. And well, we can discuss this in our chat on this unit. But I wonder if if what we're seeing now with the use of drones, with I suppose too with the use of cyber, ubiquitous cyber, that we're seeing another variation of this ongoing air power debate, kind of echoing the aspirations of the interwar imperial powers to use this new instrument as a low-cost way of imperial maintenance. Which is, I guess, by way of conclusion, to say, well, maybe it's Back to the Future. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this short lecture, and I hope that it's provoked some discussion. Let's get on with that. Thanks a lot.